for the presenters. So the title of this presentation is called Weathering the Storm, the Mental Health Impacts of Climate Change. I think an issue that's often ignored or not talked about is the mental health impacts of climate change and issues like eco-anxiety and sostasia and eco-grief, etc. To me, they're very interesting topics. So what we have here then in the description is climate change is not only an environmental crisis, it's a growing public health concern with significant and far-reaching impacts on mental well-being. This presentation explores the intersection of climate change and mental health, offering an overview of the global context to community action. We will examine the current realities of climate change, highlighting the root causes driving environmental degradation and social inequities. From there, we will explore the mental health impacts across multiple levels. These levels include individual level, which is about addressing personal responses like eco-anxiety, solastalgia, and climate grief. Community level, which is about understanding the collective toll on communities facing displacement, disaster, or resource scarcity. And system level, which is about exploring how policies, infrastructure, and institutional responses shape mental health outcomes. So the speakers include Elise Leaf. Elise is a health promoter with Nova Scotia Mental Health and Addictions in the Annapolis Valley. Born and raised in Lunenburg County, Elise has worked in a variety of capacities, supporting community health and well-being at the population level. In 2019, she graduated from Dalhousie University with a Bachelor of Science in Health Promotion. More recently, in 2022, Elise graduated from the University of Waterloo with a Master of Public Health. She brings her experience working in the nonprofit sector supporting vulnerable populations, including those experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity. This role further deepened her understanding of the social determinants of health and how these underlying interdependent and complex societal factors influence population health. Levinus Numfor was born in Cameroon, where he obtained his undergraduate degree in biochemistry in 2007 from the University of Buea, Cameroon. After that, he taught high school biology and chemistry for 5 years before immigrating to Canada in 2012. In September 2013, he enrolled into Ryerson University in Toronto to do a certificate program in food security and completed his program in December 2014. And in 2015, he was offered admission into the University of Guelph in Ontario to do a master's in public health with a major in health promotion and minor in epidemiology, and graduated in 2017. In June 2019, Levinus accepted the position of health promotion specialist with mental health and addictions for Nova Scotia Health, where he currently works in the Tri-County of Yarmouth, Digby, and Shelburne to promote positive mental health and reduce harms from substance use and gambling. His focus has been flourishing and mental wellness of vulnerable populations in rural Nova Scotia. Sarah Murphy lives on the South Shore of Nova Scotia, where she works as a health promoter with Nova Scotia Health. Sarah has worked in various sectors across Canada, including community mental health, primary health care, social work, and education. These roles illuminated overlapping patterns of policy inadequacies that led Sarah to the field of public health in search of ways to prevent illness and promote health, well-being, and equity. In her current role, Sarah works to advance the social, structural, commercial, and ecological determinants of health by supporting policy and systems change to improve population health outcomes. She's a recent graduate and member of the Health and Territory Lab at the Public Health Institute at the University of Porto. Her research explored the impacts of extreme temperature on public health in Portugal. This research reflects an interest in the intersections of human and ecological health, the determinants of health, and evidence-based policymaking. Wow, I'm very impressed by the expertise of these individuals, particularly deep expertise in health promotion. So you can carry it away. I'm not sure who's going to begin, but looking forward to hearing from you.
That's going to be me. Can you see the slides okay?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. First, I just wanted to extend our gratitude to Dr. Ingrid Waldron and the Enrich Project for inviting us to speak with you today. As Ingrid shared, my name is Elise Leaf. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a health promoter with Nova Scotia Health, Mental Health and Addictions. And today we are here to share our presentation titled Weathering the Storm, the Mental Health Impacts of Climate Change. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered in Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I also recognize that I am speaking to you today from Aesaykatik, which means place of clams, known as Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. This land is protected by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which were first signed in 1726. These treaties affirm Indigenous rights and relationships with the land, and it is essential that we honor and uphold them in our shared commitment to reconciliation and environmental stewardship. As climate change continues to threaten ecosystems, biodiversity, and traditional ways of life, we also must recognize the leadership of Indigenous communities in protecting the land and advocating for climate resilience. Their knowledge and stewardship are vital in addressing the environmental challenges we face today. I'd also like to recognize that African Nova Scotians have a deep-rooted history in this province, with communities that have existed for over 400 years. Many arrived through forced displacement, enslavement, or migration, and despite systemic barriers, they have shaped the cultural, social, and economic fabric of Nova Scotia. It is important to acknowledge the resilience, contributions, and ongoing struggles of African Nova Scotians, particularly in the face of environmental and social injustices. Climate change disproportionately affects marginalized communities, including African Nova Scotians, who have historically faced land dispossession and environmental racism. Recognizing this history means committing to climate justice, equitable land stewardship, and amplifying Black voices in environmental advocacy. So today we are going to describe the relationship between climate change and mental health, recognizing it as a public health concern with global and local implications. We're also going to identify key drivers of climate change, including environmental degradation, social inequities, and their impact on population health. We're going to look at explaining the mental health impacts of climate change at the individual level, including concepts such as eco-anxiety, solastalgia, and climate grief. And lastly, we're going to explore community resilience strategies and coping mechanisms that promote emotional well-being, social connection, and climate-informed mental health care.
Thanks, Elise. So hi, folks. I'm Sarah, and I just want to before we dive into the content, I also just wanted to recognize that many of the ideas that we're going to be covering in the next half an hour or so, they're not just academic concepts. They're felt realities that have touched all of us in different ways. So we want to be respectful of the lived experience that everyone on the call brings today to this important and challenging reality. So first, we'll cover some foundational definitions. So when we talk about health, what do we mean exactly? So in this context, from our perspective, health is much more than the absence of disease. Health is the physical, spiritual, mental, emotional, environmental, social, cultural, and economic wellness of the individual, family, and communities. And we might define health differently depending on our values, our culture, our experience, and our worldview. So from this perspective, we can see that health is not an endpoint, but rather health is considered a resource for everyday life. And we need health in order to live a dignified and fulfilling life, despite the absence or presence of a disease. And with this definition, we can also use it to expand on the concept of mental health as well, knowing that mental health and physical health are intimately connected. And we know that mental health is also, in this respect, a resource for everyday life. And so positive mental health or mental wellness supports positive health outcomes. Next slide. Okay, so when we talk about health inequity, what exactly are we referring to? So this concept, health inequity, refers to the differences in health between groups of people that are associated with social and structural disadvantage. And the key distinction here between a health inequality and a health inequity is that an inequity is considered systematic, unfair, and avoidable. So for example, if we were to say that a group of older adults has poorer health status than younger adults due to natural aging, we could consider this difference to be a health inequality, not necessarily an inequity. But if, however, we notice a trend that within this group of older adults, those with lower socioeconomic status and those from racialized communities have a lower life expectancy, then we could consider this difference to be a health inequity. Next slide. Those of us in the field of health and health promotion often get all jazzed when we talk about the determinants of health. So the determinants of health are the various factors that influence the health of individuals, communities, and populations. So these determinants can include individual characteristics like our biology, our behavior, and our lifestyle, but it's also greatly influenced by broader social, economic, and physical environments. And from this definition, we can understand that the health status of an individual, a community, or a population is not just about their access to health care, but also considering these much broader determinants of health. Next slide. So here you can see some examples. So speaking to these social, economic, and physical determinants of health, here are some examples of those conditions that influence a healthy and dignified life. So these include, for example, a safe and secure place to call home, nourishing and safe food, air, water, and land, as well as income and resources needed to thrive. Next slide. So here's another way that we can conceptualize health. So access to healthcare is important. You can see that at the top. And that healthcare is also nested in these broader social and structural determinants, as well as ecological determinants. So the work of Enrich, for example, is really highlighting how social and structural determinants, those written and unwritten rules connected to colonialism and systemic discrimination, how they can intersect with each other and influence the health of individuals and communities. And it's also highlighting how the health of our environment is intimately connected to the health and well-being of our communities too. Next slide. So shifting now to climate change. This is a great toolkit that was published by the World Health Organization last year. And it was a resource intended for health professionals to build their capacity around communicating on climate change and health. And I thought it might be interesting for the Enrich team and for the community ambassadors as a resource as well. And the toolkit really reinforces the idea that we don't have to be experts in climate science to be able to be effective climate and health communicators. We know that there's conclusive scientific evidence showing that greenhouse gases are warming the globe, and tens of thousands of scientific articles confirm these 5 points. They boil down to kind of ultimate simplicity. So it's warming, it's us, we're sure it's bad for our health, and we can fix it. Next slide.
I'm just wondering, I think there's some background noise. I'm just wondering if everyone can mute if they're not speaking. That would be great.
Thanks, Liz. Okay, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, they're the United Nations body for assessing all the science related to climate change. And this body was created in the late 80s. The image on the left is a figure showing a sharp increase in carbon dioxide emissions since the late 1800s. And many climate scientists who are much smarter than me have used many different climate proxies to analyze climate change dating back hundreds of millions of years. So they've looked at things like fossilized tree rings, ice cores, sediment studies, satellite imagery of the Earth's energy imbalance. And all of these data points paints a clear and unambiguous picture leading to scientific consensus of climate change. And so on the right, you can see an image showing the observed global mean temperature rise since the mid-1800s. And this is plotted against a counterfactual. So a prediction of what we would expect the temperature rise to be without the influence of human activities. Next slide. Okay. So when we look at global emissions, it's clear from this image that the vast majority of our emissions come from the energy sector, followed by agriculture, forestry, and land use. So in the context of our conversation and the work of Enrich around climate justice, it's important to recognize that not all countries have contributed equally to these emissions. It's something about half of our historical global emissions come from just 23 of the richest nations. So when we think about responsibility and climate justice, we'll have to navigate how countries, institutions, and corporate actors who have benefited the most are responsible to address the climate risk inequities, both within countries and across the world. Next slide. Okay. So the next few slides come from a great report that came out a few years ago by our Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam. And in this image, you can see some clear examples of climate change impacts on our health. And when I looked at the latest Enrich report, participant feedback really echoed that a lot of these climate hazards were also reported by participants here in Nova Scotia. So for example, exposure to extreme weather events like wildfires, hurricanes, flooding events, heat stress, air pollution, as well as the other hazards like changing habitat, food and water insecurity were also mentioned by participants. Folks also reported many of the health impacts noted above as well. So things like respiratory disease, impacts on mental health, heat stroke, and Lyme disease. Next slide. Sorry for the small text on this one. But this image for me really helps to kind of paint a clearer picture of the key drivers of climate change, which you can see in the green at the top, how it impacts our health, and how climate change does not have an equal impact. So at the top, you can see the key drivers of climate change, which include a culture of exploitation and a belief that nature exists for human use alone, coupled with unsustainable economic growth and development, and deforestation and land use changes. So these are kind of the key global drivers of climate change, which are leading to changes in the Earth's atmosphere, ultimately leading to climate hazards and climate sensitive health outcomes. At the bottom, you can see that some of the intersectional issues that I previously mentioned can also influence our vulnerability to these climate health outcomes. So for example, those with lower socioeconomic status, pre-existing health conditions, and those living in certain geographic locations can be at an increased risk. Next slide. Okay. So the health risks posed by a changing climate are shaped by a combination of climate hazards, exposure, and adaptive capacity. And as well, I think in reviewing the last Enrich report, there are many relevant examples that we can kind of weave into this, this evidence as well. So hazards and health risks are experienced in different ways, in different places, and by different groups of people. One element of such vulnerability is exposure. Exposure is determined in part by our living and working conditions and structural barriers such as racism and colonialism. For example, people living in neighborhoods with low socioeconomic status are generally more likely to be exposed to climate change threats. Another element of vulnerability is our sensitivity. So this is impacted by pre-existing mental and physical health conditions and our age. So for example, folks with pre-existing mental and or physical health conditions are more likely to experience disproportionate health risks during periods of extreme heat. And lastly, the final element of vulnerability here is our adaptive capacity. So whether we have the resources or the means to protect ourselves from these climate impacts. And an example of this would be that, you know, folks who have reduced access to care and preventative services are more likely to have severe health outcomes from climate stressors. Next slide. So here, this image is kind of just another graphic way to visualize the various potential effects of climate change on the health of Nova Scotian communities. And mental health is there kind of at the top of the circle. When we shift our focus to look at mental health specifically, we recognize that this relationship is complex and it also involves compounding and cascading risks. And I'll pass it off to Elise to share that with you.
Thanks, Sarah. So as Sarah spoke to, climate change affects not just our planet, but also our physical and mental well-being. In 2022, a nationwide online survey gathered responses from 1,000 young adults that were aged 16 to 25 across Canada. The results revealed that 78% of participants felt climate change affected their overall mental health, while 37% reported that it was negatively impacting their daily lives. Climate change, as you can see in this graphic, presents a range of hazards that can affect your mental health. And that includes acute events such as wildfires, floods, extreme heat waves, and hurricanes, as well as slower developing, slower onset threats, which would be droughts, rising sea levels, and melting permafrost. It can also lead to secondary challenges such as food insecurity, displacement from home or one's community, as well as housing loss. And people may experience these impacts firsthand. And what we mean by that is by living through the extreme weather events, but people are also indirectly exposed to the impacts of climate change through media coverage or witnessing the effects on others, such as close family members or friends, which can also lead to poor mental health outcomes. Those who bear the greatest burden of climate change are often the least responsible for causing it. Okay, I'm just going to switch my slides. Certain populations are more vulnerable to the mental health impacts of climate change. As we mentioned, these include but are not limited to individuals with pre-existing mental health conditions, young people, Indigenous communities, and marginalized populations. And because climate change related challenges often amplify existing stressors and health inequities, these populations face a higher risk of experiencing anxiety, trauma, and other mental health effects. For an example, climate change does disrupt the deep connection that Indigenous peoples have with their lands, threatening traditions, cultural practices, and ways of life. It also further exacerbates systemic and structural racism, restricting access to essential resources, opportunities, and social influence, while further deepening health and social inequities altogether. And this image is taken from the World Health Organization, a policy brief on the mental health impacts of climate change. And it's a really great graphic, and it shows the different types of hazards that can happen and the way folks are exposed based on different vulnerability factors and inequalities, which kind of ties into the previous slide that Sarah had shared, and the possible mental health and psychosocial outcomes that people may experience, such as mental health conditions, suicidal behavior, alcohol and substance use, as well as those new and emerging concepts like eco-grief, eco-anxiety, and solastalgia, which I'll get into shortly. And climate change can take a serious toll on mental health, as we know. So sudden climate-related disasters like floods and wildfires can trigger conditions such as trauma, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and even suicidal thoughts. One case study found that following a flood, 20% of affected individuals were diagnosed with depression, and 28.3% experienced anxiety. The mental health effects of climate change are complex and interconnected. Fully understanding them requires examining climate-related hazards, the exposure pathways, vulnerability factors, and social inequalities, and how these elements interact to shape individual and community well-being. So here we have eco-emotions and psychoterapeutic syndromes. Eco-emotions refer to the feelings people have in response to climate change. And individuals may experience a number of emotions. They can be positive, negative, depending on the personal experiences and perspectives that one has. And these emotions can also shift over time. And they can range from hope and motivation and shift to anxiety and even grief. On the left side of the screen, you'll see the Climate Emotions Wheel, which was created in partnership with the Climate Mental Health Network and Panu Fakala. And Fakala developed a system to classify these different eco-emotions. 4 of them are highlighted in this graphic, but there is 12 categories in total. The Climate Emotions Wheel is a valuable tool for recognizing and understanding the emotions related to climate change. And by identifying these feelings that you may have, individuals may lessen their intensity and develop healthier coping strategies. This Climate Emotions Wheel comes in over 30 languages, so it's pretty neat to take a look at and kind of reflect on how you may be feeling. On the other hand, psychoterapeutic syndromes is a term that was coined in 2011 by Glenn Albrecht, combining the terms psycho equaling mind and terratic equaling earth-related. These broader syndromes describe the mental health effects individuals may experience due to those negative emotions associated with climate change. And on the next slide, we will highlight a few of those. So eco-anxiety, also known as climate anxiety, refers to the persistent fear of environmental destruction and uncertainty about the future. So people might experience eco-anxiety in different ways. That's either directly by living through an extreme weather event, like a wildfire or flood, or indirectly by consuming media coverage and information about climate change and things that are happening in the world and to our planet. Because it centers on concerns about what lies ahead, eco-anxiety is future-oriented. So having anxiety about the future of climate change and how it will impact a community, for example. Eco-grief refers to the deep sorrow that you may feel due to ecological loss. So that's whether it's ongoing environmental degradation around you or perhaps something from the past. And that can include the destruction of natural resources, the extinction of species, and the erosion of environmental knowledge and cultural identity. Additionally, eco-grief can stem from anticipated future losses, and that's related to the disappearance of traditions, cultures, and ways of life, which could be tied to the natural world. And lastly, solastalgia is the distressing feeling of homesickness while you're still living in the same place. So as the environment changes, that familiar place or landscape that you're familiar with, it brings feelings of homesickness, longing, sadness, and just nostalgia for the home that was once around you. So there are a number of psychoterapeutic syndromes that have kind of come to the forefront, but these are the three most talked about, I would say. So I just wanted to share those with you. And now I'm going to pass it on to Livinus.
Thank you so much, Elise. Like Elise has been describing the individual impacts of the effects of climate change on our mental health, I will now go to the community impacts on climate change. So the first point is the influencing factors. So what are those factors that would influence a change in the community due to climate change? So here we talk about mental health literacy, communication and outreach, our healthcare professionals trained to deal with all these cases. My colleague just talked about the vulnerable population, those with low economic status. What about the adaptation, financial and physical preparedness? Is the government set in place to give supports to people in need about the climate change? The community preparedness, it's the community prepared for hurricanes or even wildfires. Are policies in place for us to prevent and treat climate-related mental health problems? So all those come under influencing factors. Then I'll go now to the economic loss. So we all know climate change comes with a lot of loss, reduced productivity. If you take out in case like in Nova Scotia, we have an agricultural and fishing population. So when there is this hurricane, there is that economic loss due to agriculture and fishing. There's also property damage. People lose their jobs, and if you don't work, you're unemployed, and then there's poverty, and then there's threat to health and well-being. People are displaced. For example, the Wi-Fi in Sherbourne, a lot of people were asked to go live in makeshift shelters, which was not convenient enough. They've been forced to migrate now to different places. There's collective violence, civil conflict, and studies actually show that increase in temperatures, for example, during wildfires or even heat strokes, increase the rate of aggression and criminal behavior. This will lead to people getting into physical assaults, family separation, and even thoughts of homicides as well. There's also increase in suicide rates, especially amongst men and older adults. So what happens to our community well-being during a climate event? There's damage to that social fabric, the setup of our community, because there's no more infrastructure that was to be there. The green spaces is off, like the lawns, the parks. Our built environment has been damaged. So it harms our social cohesion of the community resources, thereby leading to negative mental health consequences. So when we usually have prolonged heat, it leads to stress of respiratory illnesses like Sarah described earlier. There are some vector-borne diseases, malnutrition. And when all this happens, the community has poor mental health. So climate change also erodes social cohesion and exacerbate inequalities. For secondary impacts, we're talking about loss of homes, pets, livelihoods, ecosystem, and sometimes physical injuries. If you lose your home, if you lose your job, over time, you have all these financial problems. You can't fend for your family. And then there's that disconnect leading to stress, depression, despair. And most of the time, people drown their sorrows in alcohol and substance use. It leads to irritability, the sleep disruption, insomnia, and domestic violence, child abuse comes in. Like Elise just talked about eco-anxiety, that fear of the phenomenon of a climate change event, and its consequences will lead us to have some significant stress known as eco-anxiety. And all of these will shape the views of a society and future. It will lead to anger, hopelessness, especially in young people. Next slide. Now, how can we prevent or cope with all these stresses on our mental health due to climate change. So I'm going to talk about some mitigating factors on our climate and our mental health. So the first one is education. We need more education of our healthcare professionals, about the health effects of climate change. It will deal with screening, diagnosis, treatment of diseases and illnesses, the ones which we've just highlighted, and also disaster preparedness. We need training, of volunteers, of healthcare professionals. We need people to help set up shelters, triaging, referrals to community resources. So education is very important during climate change preparedness. The next one is communication. So there need to be good public health education, mental health literacy, training supports about violence prevention during such events, risk communication. We need to promote positive psychological resilience. The social supports we have in our community need to be communicated properly so that people can know where to go for what. Those connections within our community, communication of our social services that is available, culturally relevant mental health care information needs to go out there and communicate it properly, because when there's greater communication and outreach about mental health impacts, and then we can deal with this issue properly. We also need partnership and engagement. This would deal with planned relocation of communities. For example, I keep going back to Sherburne because I cover that area in my work. Communities came together. There were so many partnerships to lodge those who have been impacted by the wildfires temporarily and giving them the basic needs. So it's not one person's job. A lot of communities come together. They need to engage, in an environmental conversation like what we're having right now. In this way, we can adapt and empower individuals and communities so that they can work together and build resilience. I'm going to be talking about resilience shortly. These partnerships also, they can enhance, community preparedness for possible impacts. Intersectoral and transdisciplinary collaboration needs to happen. We're talking about healthcare, for example, public works, emergency services, the volunteers. Everybody needs to be coordinated, on adaptation initiatives. We also need to advocate for climate-informed policies, promoting mental health awareness within those climate change discourse. We have to integrate mental health into climate action. I know the government is doing a lot on climate change, but we need to put mental health into those climate action items so that together we can address the holistic impacts of climate change. We need to build our community through design. This would affect structural factors related to climate change. I'm talking about the built environment as a whole, buildings, streets, open spaces, transportation, electrical, sewage, all those need to be built properly. The pedestrians, cyclists, all need to be taken into consideration. Doorways, especially for older people, because the seniors are one of the vulnerable people in climate change. Our green spaces need to be available to allow for interaction and encourage sense of community, because that's one of the strongest points when the community come together. They can empower them to have that sense of your community. So that make use of the green space. It also we share information during that conversation to other members of our community. And we also need to communicate, talking about groundwater quality, air quality, and the potential for flooding. So we need to have that communication and that design in place. And in terms of resilience, resilience is an individual or a community's ability to cope with stress or maybe rebound, from a stressful event. So there's a document from CDC called Building Resilience Against Climate Effects. So this gives projections into public health agencies. It gives projections to public health agencies about an impending climate change. So one focus of this framework is building both individual and community resilience. Building resilience at a community level will need fostering of partnerships, improve the community's ability not to only deal with that adverse, but become stronger, because sometimes they say harsh things don't break you, but make you stronger. A community that recovers from a climate event usually is stronger when they're together. So if we build a strong community support system, in that way, individuals who would, be affected most from this climate event through our networks will be identified and they'll feel connected. Talking about seeing for example, feel connected, and in that way will increase resilience, building a robust social connectedness. A community-based approach usually, is usually talked about, especially bringing stakeholders prior to a major disaster. We are blessed being in the part of the world where certain disasters, like hurricanes, we already know before time. So we can come together, build a plan and improve the resilience of the vulnerable population. And in that way, we are encouraging community-wide engagement, in emergency planning. Next slide. And this diagram talks about building community resilience. So, climate change sometimes poses significant challenges to our mental health, and it's important for us to build this resilience through strategies that would address this climate, the mental health impacts directly. We're talking about anxiety, depression, and even trauma. So it's so important that we empower people, to navigate the emotional impacts of climate change, to build awareness, build resilience between individuals and our communities so that we can improve our health outcomes. The community planning we talked about designing so that we can identify the vulnerable population. I remember when there's hurricanes, we tell people to stay at home, get enough food in your homes, get your lighting, get your heating system, especially in the winter. When we have all this climate change preparedness, and then it will improve prevention during these disasters. The infrastructure can support people. When we have infrastructure that would support people during these events, and then it lessens the impacts on our mental health. And we could see on the right-hand side that when we have good preparedness, then there's fewer health inequities from all these climate change events. I would hand over now to Sarah to run up the presentation. Next slide.
Thanks, Livinus. So I wanted to mention next how mobilizing and thinking about community resilience on climate change can be challenging and overwhelming. And using the frame of health co-benefits can be a really powerful force in mobilizing communities. So this is from the Pathfinder Initiative, and they reviewed thousands of studies from across the world that were looking to mitigate climate change and improve public health. And they were able to demonstrate that certain interventions not only decreased greenhouse gas emissions, but they also contributed to really important health co-benefits, which included, better mental health, fewer deaths from extreme heat, less cardiovascular and respiratory disease, and lowering rates of cancer and obesity. So climate change, in addition to what Livinus talked about, climate change doesn't just have to be about talking about preparing for climate emergencies. It can be an opportunity and really a call to action for all of us to prioritize and invest in healthy and resilient communities. Next slide. So this last slide, I think the intention behind it is just kind of to sow some seeds and maybe spark some ideas as folks start to think about their individual communities' climate resilience priorities. So when I'm working with community to solve complex problems, I sometimes find it helpful to think about the different levels of government. So municipal, provincial, federal, their jurisdiction, and their responsibilities, as well as the different sectors within those levels of government. So how might those different sectors and levels of government be able to support your community resilience priorities? So when it comes to the municipal level, for example, you may want to consider whether your municipality already has a climate action plan and how your community priorities might intersect with other municipal government priorities or departments like recreation, community development, or emergency management. At the provincial level, there could definitely be funding opportunities and human resources to support your community's priorities. So, for example, the Department of Communities, Culture, Tourism, and Heritage might have funding around infrastructure or food security projects, as well as folks working within African Nova Scotian Affairs. And then within Nova Scotia Health, We have 35 community health boards across the province that are working to support community health and well-being. And many of those community health boards have identified in their latest community health plan things like mental health, social connection, climate justice, climate change, natural and built environments as community health priorities. So that's a great connection point as well. And then folks like Elise Livinus and I, we're all health promoters within Nova Scotia Health. And our role is to support community health and well-being. So we work with community to understand the determinants of health and to work alongside communities to address those determinants that we talked about earlier. So use us and we'd be happy to connect you with our respective counterparts across the province if that's of interest or relevance to you. I won't go into detail, but there are many amazing community organizations across the province that are leading work around sustainability, climate action, conservation, community health, and well-being. And then, of course, the internet is a wild and wonderful place. There are many great resources and tools that are available if you're looking for more resources for developing strategies for community mobilization and climate action. Last slide. Okay, so that concludes our presentation this afternoon. We wanted to thank all of you for the important role that you're playing to build healthy, resilient, and just communities across our wonderful province. And we look forward to hearing your insights and any questions that folks might have. Thank you.
Okay, I see there's a question from the platform. Minas, you can go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much for a really great presentation. I'm not from Nova Scotia, I'm from Ontario, involved with Ingrid's projects in Ontario. And I have a question. I think, Sarah, you mentioned at the end about, I think that table where you had government and community and online resources, I think. And in Ontario, we have a climate change plan, Transform TO, that they're looking at strategies like a strategic action plan for the next 5 years. And when you look at that plan, there isn't much in there for underserved communities. So they're looking at how do they mitigate climate change, but they're looking at the big things, right? And when you look at how, like what's in there for underserved communities, there's very little to almost nothing at all. And so how do we advocate for the government for some of these things that you talk about? And I think, Livinus, you work on the ground in these communities, and some of the things that you said like really resonate, but it's not happening here. Or maybe it's happening, but the partnerships aren't there. So maybe it's happening in health, but you don't see it from the municipality. So how do we bring those partnerships about? Because climate change is going to impact everyone, right? But I think that as just citizens, we see silos and we don't see those partnerships. So how do we as citizens advocate to see more of the partnerships, more of the pushing for strategies that the city have that just to put in there things that we don't see in there? That if a climate disaster happens right now, that those communities will be the most impacted and then there are no things in place for them. So sorry for the roundabout way, but hope you understood the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely, Minas. Great point and great question. So I know at the provincial level in Nova Scotia, we do have a provincial climate plan. I'm not off the top of my head. I can't really speak to the nuance like you're saying too, in terms of supporting equity deserving groups. I do know, and if anyone else is on the call, please feel free to jump in. I work in sort of a rural context, but our largest city, Halifax, has a climate project called Halifact, and I know that they do a lot of really important engagement with a broad range of stakeholders, and they are doing some really really critical work in terms of supporting equity deserving populations, so that it's not just a blanket approach to climate change adaptation and mitigation in Halifax. I would also give a plug for, I mentioned the Chief Public Health Officer report that was about climate change, mobilizing for climate change action. And the report that followed that was about mobilizing to build resilient communities. So it kind of takes the emergency management approach and model and puts a health promotion approach kind of on top of it. So it can be a really powerful tool in kind of conceptualizing some of the ideas that we were talking about today. I hope that helps.
And maybe just to add something to that concerning communities that are affected and they are not being engaged. In Nova Scotia, we do have community health boards, and they just had the plan for 2025-2029. And before they came up with all these priority areas, they did some engagement. I attended a few of those in the communities, asking the communities what priorities should the community health boards engage in for the next 4 to 5 years. So if you look at the new plan, climate change is one of them. So at least something is being done at the level of community health boards to engage communities that have been underrepresented or, have not been looked at in terms of environmental racism and everything. So they organized some kitchen table conversations, especially in rural Nova Scotia, engaging communities, African Nova Scotian communities, First Nations communities, and asking them what they see could be included in the next plans. So climate change came up in most of those tables, and it's on the community health board plan for the next 4 years.
Livinus, do you have a link to that? Is that shareable?
Yes.
Public?
Yeah, it is a public document. I'll just put it in the chat shortly. Yeah, it is.
I think, is it Ross? I think you may have been next.
Yeah, it's Jonathan Ross. I'm a medical officer of health. Hi. Thanks for the presentation. Bit of a complicated, actually 2 questions. Current socio-political economic trends have been somewhat disheartening in terms of climate change policy and hopefulness. So my question, first one would be, what is continuing, if anything, hopefully something, is continuing to give the 3 of you hope for positive developments and change? And related to that, do you have any suggested strategies, given that there will be inevitable fluxes in macro political trends? Do you have any strategies that can allow important climate change work to continue regardless of those trends?
Do you want me to take a stab at the
Yeah,
question?
sure. You can. Yes.
I'll answer the second question first. So in terms of how to navigate this work in spite of the fluxes that you were alluding to, I found a lot of insight and very helpful resources coming from an organization called ReClimate. And they are like a strategic climate communications think tank based out of Carleton University. And they're doing a lot of really interesting research around climate communications. So thinking about different segments of the population and what their personal, social, and cultural norms are, and how we can create climate messages that resonates with these different segments of the population. So I think the more that we can kind of create messages that align with folks across the spectrum of political views or social values, the more effective that we will be in mobilizing large groups and large swaths of the population to see their vested interest in this important global health issue.
Sorry, what is the name of the group? It's a bit hard to hear you just to. Yeah.
Reclimate, like
Re.
Reclimate, like about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you.
I
will look them up.
Yeah, and for me personally, hope. Yes, I would just say that it just feels like a moral imperative to do this work, regardless of how difficult it is. I have a 5-year-old son. And I'm making the choice to try to do my work personally and professionally with my eyes wide open, as hard as that can be some days. Yeah, so that's me. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Sarah.
I might just add, so Sarah, I'm currently working in rural Nova Scotia, and we see these issues, especially in the vulnerable population. What gives me hope is the community in which I work. I'm connected to underserved communities, and the government machinery grinds very slowly. So unfortunately, there isn't much action happening, but it doesn't deter me from continuing working with communities to build resilience. Like we participated in the Ingrid's project 2 years ago when they were engaging these African Nova Scotian communities on climate change preparedness. So for me, I think that's a big step. Let's start from the grassroots, look at what this community is facing. So many participants brought up ideas in which, I'd never heard about, but the community is there, engage with them, listen to them, hear what, people have in their minds, and then there'll be better preparedness in a climate event. Unfortunately, nothing like change hasn't happened yet, but we have a dump. I was told by a community member here in Yarmouth that there was a dump site over 50 years ago, and people lived near the dump site, and it's still affecting people, these days. The same thing happened in Sherbourne. So it is a difficult issue, but just building resilience with groups and avoiding burnout and just building, community connections and resilience, for me, it's the way forward.
Thank you.
Thanks. Janet?
Hi, thanks very much for organizing this, Ingrid. This has been really, really interesting, and thank you all for your presentations. Sarah, I was looking, one of the last slides you put up was of community mobilization, and I'm just coming to the last write-up phase, the last year of write-up for a project that it feels like I've been working on forever, but substantively for 4 years, on public health governance. And we've been trying to build something that requires, in that, how you've got it in columns, and we've got, we've got municipal, provincial, and federal, and nobody is really accountable to one another, and public health isn't accountable. Public health, and I subsume it within public health climate change, and none of they all pass it off. The buck is passed off from one level to the other, and then we get a super majority provincial government, and all of a sudden they're talking uranium mining and all sorts of other things that are just like, holy shit, I didn't vote for this. I mean, I didn't vote for them anyway, but really, and so it strikes me that all of our community organizing and all the work that we can do, I mean, and all the hope that we have brought to this work all of our lives doesn't really count for a hill of beans when we're dealing with political leaders who hold no accountability, and that are not speaking with all levels of the polis, of the people who have elected them, from the people who have elected them to the leaders in the other areas of, municipal, provincial, federal. So we have this huge gap in Canada in public health governance and in climate, addressing climate, where all of these sectors, with the exception perhaps of community, but I think I'm being naive in that, are really influenced enormously by commercial determinants of health, by really industry, and increasingly in the last 10 years, it's through social media in commercial factors. And I think that, you know, the polarization into like sort of Trump and the others, or Poilievre and the others, you know, kind of speak to that. So we're really dealing with a crisis of governance and the fact that people don't really count, and all the community work that we can do and all the community work we believe in and hope for isn't really mattering anymore. So I don't want to, I mean, that sounds about as negative as it can be, and I don't mean to, because I can also move into hope. But I'm just wondering, I'd like to sort of throw it back at you, Sarah, with the, you know, and especially most of the speakers here are members, work for the provincial government. Can you actually speak to how, and this is going to be really rude, I'm sorry about that, but can you speak to the fact of how ineffective the provincial government is in addressing these things?
Thanks, Janice. Difficult, but really important points raised. To be honest, I don't know exactly how to answer your question. You know, we work within Nova Scotia Health, so we're kind of, you know, the province would have the jurisdiction around public health, the Public Health Act, and we're kind of the implementation arm of that. So I don't have the inside scoop for you. But maybe just to highlight that something that we didn't directly touch on, you know, when we were talking about the root causes and the key drivers of climate and the inequities, part of taking action in climate resilience